What risks have you had to consider when you were deciding whether to participate in the early rounds of the Bristol-Avon catchment market?
Sure, okay. So as I said earlier, we own land, we bought our own land, and we're hugely emotionally invested in that land. I know every square inch of that land, and most landowners will do. There'll be some that've got very large holdings, or they're held as, as a farm manager. It's not a family farm. But if you're looking at family farms, there's huge emotional investment in the land. And actually, for me, that was the biggest part of this. It's quite big and scary. Now, I've also been a corporate lawyer alongside that for 25 years, so I've done a lot of big deals. I'm quite comfortable buying a company for 100 million or something like that. But nothing quite prepared me for the moment when I had to press the button on a project which for us was quite risky as a family, and it's our family future we're talking about. So it's kind of the enormity of the idea of 30 years. The average age of a farmer, we're just debating this, has always been over 60. I think the average age of a farmer has always been over 60 because they're the people that own the land and they pass it on. But in reality, a lot of the people that are making the decisions are quite elderly or entering retirement, and they will not see this land come out of this project. And that's quite big and scary when you're doing it for yourself. In terms of the risks we looked at, the delivery risks were the least of our worries. We know how to dig holes. We know how to plant trees. We've thought about how to integrate livestock back into these schemes once they're established. And we had some wonderful debates about, we have wild beaver where we live. How do we accommodate wild beaver? How do we get our cattle back onto this scrub mosaic to really try to replicate how a natural macroherbivore would encourage that habitat rather than me going in with a chainsaw. So all that stuff is relatively straightforward. But I've got a list of 7 of the big scary thoughts you have, and forgive me for reading them out, but system complexity. This is a big structure. This is quite a complex. You've got a JV in the marketplace dealing with a farmer that's got to deal with this huge market complexity. A lot of farmers are quite comfortable going down the local livestock market and flogging a couple of cows. This is very, very different. I have been up at midnight trying to fill in countryside stewardship forms the last 20 years and been on the verge of tears because I do not understand what they're talking about. Well, this is more complex. So the need for simplicity, I think, is a enduring theme. Complexity of the on-farm calculation. There's a lot of science goes into this. I have a small degree of insight into what the team do. But if you sit down with a farmer and explain to them about biodiversity, net gain 4.0, and why it values certain things and not others, it is all just crazy. And it's just another barrier to entry. Consent authorizations, the joy of dealing with local authorities on planning permission for a wildlife pond has just blown my mind. It is just an unbelievably complex process trying to explain an inherently natural phenomenon you're trying to create and deliver it in a way that is intensively engineered so you can speak to the language of the people that are going to be reviewing it. If there's one simple thing you can do, it's just get rid of planning permission for wildlife ponds, because it's just crazy. But it imposes traction in the process. It's inertia in the process. We're having to put in cost for consenting processes that shouldn't really exist. I've recently planted just under 5 hectares of wood pasture, and at the very late in the day, we're only putting in 35 stems per hectare. But it triggered something that has been put out relatively recently by, I think, the Forestry Commission or Natural England. So I had to go through the Natural England Forestry Commission process, and it took 2 months, and we've taken a risk on planting without it. Fortunately, we got that consent earlier this week, but it's more friction in the system, and the more of that can be taken away, the easier it will be. Gosh, I'm taking a long time. Contingency. Scary stuff that can happen in the future you don't know about is a big concern and a risk. And there is a couple of ways the market has helped mitigate that, which I'll come on to. Indexation. So the Bank of England, I believe, will predict interest rates out by about 2 years with a 70% certainty level or something. You're asking farmers to take an indexation risk of 30 years. The way this potentially is conceived, and there are some very good mitigations for that, but it is another concern. It's the reason PFI didn't work particularly well, is because you have layers upon layers of de-risking, and the more of those that can be taken out at the front end, the better. Tax, people have already mentioned. There's the inheritance tax dimension, which is so close to farmers' minds you will not believe it. And then there's also corporation tax if you have lumpy income and you can't match your income against your expenses. And lastly, just the compliance burden. I am, for my sins, a lawyer. I quite like the structure of law and the way you can take complexity and reduce it to simplicity. But for most farmers, encountering a Section 106 deed for the first time is not a pleasant experience, and trying to help people through that. Now, I do have mitigations for that. Would you like me to go on very quickly?
Yes, please, Richard. If you could talk a bit about how the market maybe helps manage some of those risks. Thank you. So
the first one, actually, and I didn't think about this until last night when I sat down for the first time and tried to work out what on earth I was going to say this morning. The first one actually is trust. And for me, that's the most important part of all this, is very quickly formed a relationship with Wiltshire Wildlife Trust. Inherently people, it's an NGO, I inherently trusted that I thought they had ecology at the fore, which helped tick a box, and then trade as well. So for me, if this had been a standalone commercial entity, that trust would not have been there, full stop. I would have had a degree of skepticism, which would have added onto the inertia, the barriers to entry. So the way it's been incredibly well structured, from my perspective, is I didn't even realize the way that it had been structured and the thought that had gone into it. But the net effect of that was the degree of trust that allowed it very easy for me to meet the people, to trust them, and to take a punt, which is essentially what we did. Complexity of on-farm calculation, that effectively completely taken away from us. We could never have done that. As I said, I'm happy planting a tree, I'm happy choosing the species of tree. I can't do the calculations, and that was completely removed from our responsibilities. If it had been a full-blown, dyed-in-the-wool commercial entity, I think there would have been more skepticism about the numbers I was being told, and that would have acted as a brake on my enthusiasm as well. I have no mitigation for consents or authorisations. There is no mitigation other than getting rid of planning permission for wildlife ponds. It's just one of those. It's a structural impediment that hopefully will be smoothed over time, and you just need to be patient and work through it. Around contingency and indexation, and actually tax and compliance, all four of those risks really are a function of the size of the project you're doing. And there's a very simple mitigation we did for this. And what we did is we chose two small projects. So we put 2 acres of former arable land that had been in a turning circle of a much larger field that had been very heavily compacted on about 6 inches of subsoil and topsoil overlying very, very heavy clay that until 40 years ago, when it was drained, would never ever have been farmed arably. It was only ever wet pasture for summer hay. And we put those 2 acres in, so we weren't taking a massive risk. And the last round we'd done, we put some hedging in. We managed our risk. We had countryside stewardship in the back pocket if it didn't work. But they're small projects, and you can build a portfolio effect with a combination of countryside stewardship, SFI when it comes in, Bristol Avon catchment market, and we also have a local one which is funded wood pasture for bat habitat. But building a portfolio effect has been for us the key mitigation, and we've effectively taken a lot on trust. We've accepted it may not work, and we've been prepared to take that risk, and we've invested our own time. We've taken risk with our own time, primarily, not on external expenditure. But between those, I think the portfolio effect is probably the most powerful mitigation, and the remainder of them are beyond our control, but provided by the catchment market itself.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard.